Over half of the world's population live in cities. They are the site of most of our built assets, economic activities, and cultural traditions. By 2050, around 2.5 billion additional people will be living in cities.
To avoid catastrophic climate change, safeguard lives and livelihoods, and keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, cities need to act with more urgency and ambition than ever before.
This subsection will focus on how cities have faced the climate crisis in politically challenging and economically constrained contexts. It will show that although cities are part of the crisis, they are also integral to its solution.
To kick off this discussion, we have brought Mark Watts, the Executive Director of C40 Cities, to speak to you about the role of cities in tackling the climate crisis. Mark, welcome. It's great to have you here. We have seen so far in this course how the climate crisis is global, but the impact is local. So the sea level is rising, storms and floods are more intense, temperatures are getting at record highs, but the impact of all this comes to people, and people live in cities. So why are cities essential in solving the climate crisis?
Well, I think the first thing is, just as you say, most people now live in cities. That's where emissions are largely produced. It's also where we can see in the news every day now, sadly, where climate impacts are being felt and where they affect largest numbers of people because of the concentration of people in cities. But actually, I think more importantly than that, it's because you're really seeing political leadership at a city level that has escaped the national governments, the presidents and the prime ministers. Our chair, Sadiq Khan, likes to talk about mayors being the doers, not the delayers. And I think that's really true. City leaders really got to grips with tackling the climate crisis and really willing to talk to each other, to work together across political boundaries, across geographic, cultural boundaries, to all go faster together.
We're seeing a movement of cities committing to net zero and to climate resilience. So can you tell us a bit about this and why is this important?
It's essential to have a science-based approach to tackling climate change that establishes the budget, the total amount of emissions that you can risk putting into the atmosphere and stay below that. So in C40, we've had for a number of years now a Deadline 2020 programme where all of our cities have committed to produce a robust emissions inventory and a plan of action for how they will constrain emissions in line with their own fair share of that science-based budget.
And can you tell us a bit about the Cities Race to Zero movement and why is that relevant to the world?
Well, Cities Race to Zero, I think, is incredibly exciting, probably the most positive thing that came out of COP26 Glasgow last year, because you had 1,000+ cities, including all of the C40 ones, committing to science-based targets. Most importantly, by 2030, their fair share of halving emissions. So not long distance net zero, mid-century somewhere, but what they're going to do right now, the people in power right now, how they're going to use that power to bring down emissions and to work together in order to achieve that.
So the purpose of this course is to inspire cities to take action. And I want to know from you, what are cities doing, especially in the Global South, that can be inspiring to other cities?
Well, there's a lot of inspiration to share. One of the cities I'm most excited by is Jakarta, Indonesia, one of the most climate-threatened cities in the world, quite literally sinking, but where the governor there, Anies Baswedan, has had this extraordinarily bold drive to bring public transport to everybody, so everyone to be within 500 metres of mass transit of public transport, and increasingly now electrifying that bus fleet. Or if we look on the other side of the world, in Buenos Aires, here the mayor is trying to deliver what he calls a well-being city, but it's a sort of a Latin American take on the 15-minute city concept, the idea that everyone should be able to live within 15-minute city walk or cycle of the services that you need, the education, health, but green space also. So that I find very inspiring. I don't think I could not mention Freetown, Sierra Leone, incredible mayor, Meraki Soya. Freetown, Tree Town is her mantra. And this is a country and a city devastated by civil war some decades ago. One of the consequences of that civil war was a mass destruction of the forests around Freetown. That's exacerbated flood risk for the city as well as increasing the urban heat island effect. So Mayor Aki Soy has had a plan to rejuvenate the city by replanting the forest, but as a job creation scheme as well as an environmental measure. So looking at lots of jobs in agribusiness, in the science of how to manage the forest over time, and the medicinal properties of many of those trees that can then be brought into Falmer. And I guess, you know, we should also talk about the two big kind of countries in the global south, India and China. China, you know, really, the cities there, the absolute world leaders on vehicle electrification. Shenzhen has had an electric bus fleet, 14,000 strong for 3 or 4 years now, where most cities are still in the 10 or 20 vehicle stage. Incredibly inspiring. And equally now we're starting to see cities like Qingdao take up the mantra of clean construction. So half of all construction in the world takes place in China. So it really matters that they clean how they construct. So finding ways to reduce the carbon content of the materials of construction, particularly in concrete and steel. And then finally, but last but not least, in India, in Mumbai, and in fact the whole of Maharashtra state, an administration that's really focused on solarising the energy, the electricity, but alongside this climate budget that I talked about earlier. So they're one of the pilot cities looking at how that in a big global south administration, you can manage the financial budget every year to make sure that it's delivering on carbon targets.
So although there's a lot being done, many global south cities have issues such as health, education, infrastructure to sort out. And sometimes they consider these as priorities and climate action as a separate topic. Why is it important for cities to integrate climate action with other sectors?
Well, I think we need to separate out two things. So the global south in general, global south cities are not responsible for the climate crisis, and the leadership on tackling it has to come from the countries that cause the problem, the richest countries in the world, mostly in the global north. But I think the reason why there is a motivation to focus on reducing emissions, on greening the economy, when there are incredible pressing priorities around jobs and poverty and health, is because actually the fastest route to create good new jobs is to move more quickly to a green economy. The best way to improve the health of everybody in your city is to get rid of the pollution that is driving a lot of that ill health. And certainly we see in the analysis that C40 has done, there are far more good new jobs that can be created in the faster a city moves off fossil fuels into a green economy, and particularly in things like the transport sector in the global south, in the nature-based solutions like in the Freetown, Treetown example. There's lots of jobs in cleaning and greening the city that just aren't there in the old polluting industries that actually often in a global south context just suck money out of the country and don't really benefit local people, whereas generally speaking green technologies are locally based and create local jobs.
What is your top recommendation for cities that are starting now to plan for climate action?
Well, my recommendation is probably a bit nerdy, but plan. Don't skip the planning phase. What we see in C40 cities, the cities that step back, get good data, plan for how they're going to develop their economy, their societies in a clean and a green and a fairer way, they deliver 3 times as much action as the cities that just try and go for it. So take the time to plan and consider and look to organisations like C40 to provide the support to do that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you.